Hello, and welcome to another edition of Cultural Conversations with the Big South. And I'm host Darius Thigpen. This episode, we are going to focus on the late Jerome Kersey, a legendary Longwood Lancer and a longtime pro who spent most of his time in the NBA with the Portland Trailblazers. And we're here to speak about the quality of the man that Jerome was, a big man on the court, but larger than life off of it. On with us, Jerome's daughter, Kiara Kersey. Kiara, how are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing really well. Excited to have you on. And also on with us is the author of the new book on Jerome Kersey, Overcoming the Odds. He's Kerry Edgars, and he covered Jerome during his time with the Trailblazers. Kerry, how are you doing, sir?
Hey, good, Darius. Thanks for having me on.
Well, the two of you each go back quite a ways. Kerry, I'm sure you would remember it a little bit better than Kiara would, but you had the chance of meeting her a few years back, did you?
Yeah, she was a knee-high to a grasshopper. Actually, I've told this story before that Jerome was the only athlete in 45 years of covering sports that I invited over for dinner. He and Kiara's mother, when she was, like I said, a toddler, and we had them over. I had three young boys at the time, and it was a highlight of their life. They still talk about it today. They were the toast of the neighborhood to have Jerome Kersey come over and have dinner with us.
And Carol, when you hear stories like that, because I'm sure you probably can't remember that exact interaction, but when people just were in awe of getting to be around your dad, I mean, how does that make you feel?
It makes me feel great. And like you said, I half the stories I don't personally remember because a lot of them took place like back in the heyday of basketball when I was like, still really little. But I love hearing the stories anyways, because it is a part of who I am as well as who my dad was. And it speaks so much to who he was as a person off the court, which is the part that most people didn't get to see.
Well, Carrie, you go by the title of Dean of Portland Sports. You've been locked in on Portland sports, Oregon in general, your whole life. Your dad was an SID at Oregon State. Many people may know of your work from writing a book on the so-called jailblazers of the early 2000s. So you go from your laser focus on the Pacific Northwest to Southside Virginia, Longwood University. How did Jerome Kersey take your focus from your market to a completely different part of the nation?
Well, let me give you a little bit of background, Darius, how the book came about. Some folks in Virginia, Hope Curry had been an SID, as you know, at Longwood, and had started a book on Jerome years ago, had never completed it, and a group wanted to get that completed. So they reached out to me. As you said, I covered Jerome during his heyday with the Blazers from '89 to '92 when they reached the NBA Finals twice, and I decided that after talking to them and making sure we had a publisher that was willing to do it, I decided, okay, let's go for it. I did get to know Jerome fairly well. We did a lot of TV type, studio type work together in the last few years of his life. And of course, I knew him through his entire 17-year career. And, when I thought about this story, Darius, I mean, this is not just your average NBA player. This is a guy who came from a Division III school, was really off the radar, a second round draft pick. The question was whether they're going to send him to Europe for a year or two of seasoning. Decided, okay, we're going to keep him, but he's probably going to be a bench guy. By his second year and third year, he became a starter and became a 17-year NBA guy, and not just a quality player, but a quality human being. In doing this book, I realized how thoroughly he was loved by not just the fans of Oregon, but his friends. I had at least 5 of his friends tell me he's my best friend. We were best friends. Well, you can't be best friends with all those guys, but he was the kind of guy that made you feel that way about him.
Well, Kiara, I've heard so many people speak about your father in exactly those terms, where they feel like he was their best friend. When you hear that and then compare it to your own relationship with your dad, I mean, what really stands out about the man who he was for everyone else as a public figure, but then the dad he was for you?
Well, actually, the funny thing is the synonymous things with who he was in the public and who he was at home were the best qualities about him is that he was a leader and he wasn't afraid to speak his mind, and he was able to give you the hard facts and able to have the realness, the real conversations um, and that's all you could want in a father figure, and what the people could want in somebody they look up to in the community. Somebody that is honest and has a kind heart, and really is selfless.
And Carrie, I mean, for us as outsiders, we think we know someone, but then you had the experience as a journalist getting to know him personally, and then really digging into his backstory when writing this book. Was there any difference, or was it like Kara said, really he was exactly who people thought he was, as far as just being a great guy?
She used two words that I think kind-hearted and selfless that I really do describe Jerome. He was a guy that would actually listen to people. A lot of the pro athletes get to be where they're almost they expect star treatment. He got star treatment, don't get me wrong, but I think he related so well to people because he didn't act like a big shot. He would smile and get to know people and take the time for people when they stopped him on the street. Didn't like to be interrupted. Kiara will tell you this when he had dinner. But after dinner, he'd always take care of people with autographs and pictures and that sort of thing. And he was the real deal as far as being a person that could relate. I mean, he was so popular in Portland, he could have run for political office and won. I'm almost sure of that.
When you think of Jerome's playing style, so aggressive on the court, you mentioned a little bit about his background, being a Division II guy who was barely going to make the team, it seems like. You would assume that a guy like that may have a chip on his shoulder, but giving his persona, it doesn't really seem like he was that kind of guy who was ornery at all. What in his backstory, or what in his upbringing really made him someone who could be so affable and so easygoing, as in compared to having such a tough way and tough path to the NBA?
Yeah, he was especially as he got older, he was a really physical player. He had two nicknames, Darius: Crazy, on the court, I should say, Crazy, and the Rundown Man. Crazy because he went after it with every bit of ounce of energy that he had. And then the Rundown Man, he did rundowns before LeBron James did. In other words, he caught guys on breaks and he would swat them away as they were trying to go up to dunk but it was his hustle and his style of play. And then off the court, he was more of a gentle soul. I think Kiara will tell you that. So there was definitely a difference in the way that he played on the court and the way that he played off. And I think the reason he played like that on the court was he was always an underdog, and that's what the title of our book is, Overcoming the Odds. He had to overcome huge odds to make the NBA. In the end, he was a great success story.
Kiara, talking about your dad's background, small town Virginia, goes to Longwood University. How much of that was a presence in your life growing up? How much did your dad talk about his early days and that making him the man who he was?
He very much he didn't necessarily talk about like a lot of personal experiences, but in the way that he carried himself and the way that he parented, I saw how it related when I'd go back east and I'd see the family and Grandma Mary, my grandma or great grandma who raised him. I definitely saw a lot of similarities in their mannerisms. And I was like, oh, that's it. That's the, what would you call it? Whatever level of strictness that there was. And that was how he was able to, like you guys were saying, is rise from that, and not having much, being kind of underprivileged, and that's how he was able to push through and persevere through all of that. Is that Grandma Mary, who has just passed away very recently, that woman was a force to be reckoned with, and it definitely passed down to my father.
So glad you mentioned her, Kiara. I'm sorry about your loss. This just happened a couple of weeks ago. May was the very first person I interviewed for this book. And she and her husband, Herman, raised Jerome really from the time he was a baby, and did a fantastic job. And I think the word you were looking for was discipline. They instilled discipline in Jerome that stayed with him for his entire life and helped him, not just in his professional athletic career, but also I think in the type of person that he was.
Definitely.
Yep, the discipline, the good old grandmother, tough love. Is that really what made Jerome who he was?
Personally, I definitely think so. She was the main driving force in his life, and that, it's something he could really, I think, cling on to, and that motivation going forward.
I don't think so. She was the one that was hitting him on the hands with the ruler all the time. She was one. Yeah, when she had something to say, she would say it. She made sure and then I think Herman was probably the one that stepped in if there needed to be some paddling. And in those years, the kind of paddling that they did it. There was some physical discipline involved. I remember Jerome talking a little bit about that. So, but really, such a credit to Mrs. Kersey that she was able to have a youngster like that. Keep in mind, she had, I think it was 7 of her own children that she had to deal with in addition to Jerome. And wow, that's just so impressive to me.
And one of the things that popped up on my radar when I was researching for this conversation that I'm sure really no one could have prepared Jerome for was his time at Longwood. The social setting, it was not ideal. You go back to the 80s where you have a newly co-ed school, Southside Virginia. You kind of have an understanding of what it was to be a black man in those days, but he's still Jerome was in a story that was told by one of his best friends, Kevin Brandon. He would be the guy to kind of connect the different social groups. He would go up to a group of white guys from a different team, whether it was soccer or cross country or something of that matter, and kind of be the connection point. So, Carrie, when you hear a testimony like Kevin Brandon's about the man who Jerome was and the impact that he had way outside of basketball, I mean, what does that speak to maybe the culture that he was able to build around him? And did stories like this make it into the book?
Yeah, and by the way, he was like that in Portland too. I mean, he was a connector of not of people of all races and creeds and everything. And I know that started probably when he was a young kid and really reached fruition there during his years at Longwood. I asked Kevin and some of the black athletes that were there during that time how it was for them. It was still not far from the Jim Crow days in the South. And they said on campus, it was great. It was terrific. The city of Farmville, they have some issues, but not on campus. And part of that was they were all accepted. And I think Jerome, I mean, he was the BMOC during that time. I mean, he was the king. And because he was so accepting of everyone, I'm sure that it made it easier for all the black athletes during that time.
But Carol, when you hear that your dad was the big man on campus, I mean, would you have guessed that if you didn't like already know some of these stories, just the way that he generally was with you?
You know, so kind of he was a very to himself person when just hanging out. He's very laid back. There we go.
Mm.
He's very laid back when we're at home, or even if we're out to dinner or something. He's a super calm, collected guy that kind of just, he just kind of happy to be with me and with Terry, and when we'd hang out. And it's funny to hear him talk about that, because I'm picturing college kid all like jacked up on energy and stuff like that, and I can't it's hard to picture my dad like that. So I like hearing the stories. It's like, oh yeah, he was a kid too.
Well, how much does it take you back when you see your dad in pictures where he's got the high top fade going and you see him
Oh
wearing
my
his
gosh.
short shorts from the 80s? Like, does that
Well,
throw you off when you see that?
funny story about the short shorts thing is, you know in school, once the other kids found out who my dad was, you'd hear their moms talking about, oh, I just used to think your dad was so cute in those short shorts. I'm like, I don't need to hear that. I'm in middle school. I don't need to hear that.
Also Darius, he was fantastic with kids. And I remember my boy was probably 5 or 6 years old, went to a practice with me one day and he wore a hat. And Jerome, he had a pretty big head, my son, even at a little age. I remember Jerome taking it, putting on his head and again, wow, you got a big head, and kidding with Nick. And Nick thought, he remembered that for the rest of his life, I think. but the apple of his eye was Kiara. And he talked often about his young daughter until Harley was born. And then Kiara can tell you about that. When he was grandpa, Jerome, then she lost a little of the attention to her daughter.
Yeah,
So how was Grandpa Jerome?
Grandpa Jerome was, I think, the best version of Jerome, and it's the one that was with us for the least amount of time, unfortunately. I wish everybody, well, yes and no. I wish everybody could have seen the way he was with her, but at the same time, it's nice to have just that for myself and for our family. Just these little moments stick out to me, like watching a 6'8" man who's larger than life to everybody else, including me, change the diaper of a 6-pound, 5-ounce baby is just about the most precious and funniest thing that you could witness. And he was so comfortable in being a grandfather, and I love seeing it too. That's, like I said, that's the best version of my dad that I've ever seen, and I couldn't be more thankful for the time that we got together and for the time that he got to spend with Harley. Excuse me.
Kiara, no, it's all right. We appreciate you taking the time out so much to talk about your dad. You gave him so much joy, it would seem, and you allowed to the rest of the world. You shared Jerome Kersey with all of us. It's going back to even first seeing when you spoke at his ceremony back in 2015. The way that you spoke about him as a larger than life figure, that was one of the reasons I really did want to have you on to speak here, because it was apparent just how much you loved him, how much he loved you, how special that relationship was, and how much of a giving man he was with his time. So I do appreciate you taking the time out to share some of your memories of your dad with us. And I do want to kind of, as we begin to wrap up, speak to one of the things that your father gave even in death was with his being an organ donor. He saved the lives of 8 children. And that donation is something that, I mean, certainly no one can ever look at as anything other than just an absolute miracle. But Kiara, how else, if we missed anything, did your dad touch the lives of others that we might not have addressed?
There was one thing that I did an interview a while back for ESPN, and I forgot to bring it up, as they're asking me questions, firing away, and I kept trying to think of things. But when people die, there's holes missing from certain, and sometimes those holes are unnoticed because it wasn't in the public eye. It wasn't something that a lot of people knew about. And one of those things was after the Blazer games, usually the suites would just throw out the food, whatever was left over. And there's a lot of food left over. And what my dad would do is he'd go around, he'd have us go home in one car. He'd go around to, all the suites and get whatever good food was left. And he'd take it to homeless shelters in the city. And, it's just little things like that. Nobody told him to do it. There wasn't any press covering it. He wasn't posting it on the internet, nothing like that. It's just one of those things that he was just doing out of the goodness of his heart. And, something that ended up is now missing from that, and then just visiting children's hospitals just because, nothing specifically said it. He'd call and say, hey, can I come visit? Basically, little things like that. It's the little things, that really count. Stuff in the community, just going down to the Boys and Girls Club, whatever it is. And even just for individual people too, people that would see him around town. I still get people sending me stories about, if they find me on Instagram or on Facebook and they message me a quick story. They're like, hey, I met your dad at a car wash and he said this and this to me. I'll never forget it. Those little moments that are so special to people. and just that those won't happen anymore. Eventually the stories will stop, at some point. But yeah, the little things.
Yeah, Darius, to add a little context to what Kiara said, I'm so glad she brought those up. When after he retired, he became an ambassador for the Blazers. He wasn't just an ambassador, he was the ambassador. They had a set of several guys that did it, but he was really the most prominent one. And in doing that, that's when he decided that he was in these suites talking to donors and season ticket holders, and realized that all this food was going to waste. And so then that's when what Kiara was referring to is he would scoop up the food and take it down on it by itself and spread it in Old Town where the homeless were basically staged at that point. And it was a wonderful thing. And I'm glad she mentioned Boys and Girls Club, because he and Terry Porter were the two players. That Tracy Rose was the person who was in charge of the players during that time, their civic contributions. She said of all the players during about 25 years of the Blazers that were the best in contributing things and giving of their time to charities and she said children's hospitals, they were Terry Porter and Jerome Kersey. So that's another thing to be very, very proud of.
Well, Carrie, your book, Overcoming the Odds, celebrates the life of Jerome Kersey. And it really is a culmination of, as you mentioned earlier, the work of so many other people, with Hope Curry, the former SID at Longwood, having his work in there as well. You compiled all of the interviews. So it's a lot of material that people will have at their disposal, a number of wonderful stories of Jerome Kersey. But if there's just one passage or one takeaway that readers could take from the book, what would you say it is?
Oh boy, that's awful tough. I don't know. I think we've covered it really, Darius, in the way that his there was a glow about Jerome, and that was very rare. I mean, he had a charisma to him that it was just it was because of Blazers. We only have one professional team in Portland of the top 4 leagues, and because they are in such a goldfish bowl, he became just a living legend, and he handled it so well. And I think when people read the accounts of both his friends and other people that knew him through this book, I think they'll begin to realize that.
Kiara, the legacy of your father can certainly be felt at Longwood, with the court named in his honor. Kevin Brandon created a scholarship in Jerome's name. From the moment that you spoke at his memorial service, again, you just made it so apparent how much this man should be celebrated and honored. So for anyone who never had the pleasure of getting to see Jerome play, never got to witness his radiant smile, what do you want those of us who never got to meet Jerome Kersey to really know about him as a man?
Pay it forward. He is very much a giving person. He wanted to give me the world, but also give me perspective. He wanted to, give his all on the court. And I just think that just be a good person, be a good person in your community, be a good person in your family, in your hometown, to whoever you may meet on the street. Just give somebody a smile. I know it's hard with the masks now, but you see somebody on the street, give them a smile. Pay it forward. Pay forward kindness, love, goodness, just whatever you can.
Well, you both have been excellent. I truly appreciate your time and your heartfelt sentiments all about Jerome. As we wrap up, one thing that we certainly like to do, we like to promote what our guests for the podcast are working on, charities or organizations that it might choose to highlight. Kiara, your dad had so many different things that he was working on in life and that have been continued on after his passing. What of Jerome's work would you like to highlight as we wrap up?
Well, currently, his wife Terry and his sister-in-law Lana and I, we started the JK25 Foundation. So if you want to look that up, go ahead. We're on Instagram and Facebook and everything, and it helps give money to children that can't afford dental surgeries. And he was always about his smile. That was one of the things that everybody loves to remember about him. So that's something that we've been he started in on, and we're trying to continue.
Well, a portion of the book proceeds from the book here will go to the foundation and also to the scholarship at Longwood that Kevin Brandon started, which is really nice. You'll be able to buy the book. I know you can buy it at my website, carryeggers.com. My web supervisor is constructing a jeromekersey.net. I think it's called jeromekersey.net. It's not ready yet, but it'll be up. Both of those places you'll be able to buy the book and get it pretty soon.
That's awesome. We're certainly looking forward to that book's release. As for me, I like to always give a shout out to the Black Play-by-Play Scholarship and Grant Fund. The fund is a scholarship opportunity for Black college students interested in learning the art of sports play-by-play. It's a growing network that young Black broadcasters will be able to rely on as they get started in their careers to make sure that we can also hear representation in the broadcast booth as well as we see it on the court and in the field of play. Also, a huge thank you to Dr. Ron Brown at Longwood. He's done some excellent work at Longwood with the Alumni Network to help get this book going, help working with you, Carrie, on getting the book published. And also thank you to Terry Kersey, Jerome's widow, who is president of the Jerome Kersey Foundation, for continuing so much of Jerome's work. You both have been excellent. Kiara Kersey and Carrie Eggers, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Darius.
Thank you.
And thank you, viewers, for tuning in to Cultural Conversations with the Big South. We'll see you next time.